I'm Jennifer Ewing. I'm with the City of Bellevue. I'm the Environmental Stewardship Program Manager. I just wanted to welcome those of you here who aren't from Bellevue. Good to see a lot of Bellevue staff here as well. Jamie Strobel from King County in the Climate and Energy team is going to introduce our panelists today, so I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you so much. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the City of Bellevue, and on behalf of the Sustainable Cities Roundtable program, as well as K4C and the King County Green Tools program, I want to thank the City of Bellevue for hosting us today for this month's roundtable. We'd also like to recognize and thank the elected officials who have taken time out of their busy schedules to be here today, including Bill Ramos from the Issaquah City Council over there. Carol Simpson from the Newcastle City Council, thank you both for being here. Are there any other elected officials in the room who might not have signed up? Okay. I also want to take the opportunity to make a couple of announcements. So, upcoming next month's roundtable will be hosted by the City of Kent. From noon to 1:30, we'll be focusing on climate change and health impacts. So, hope to see some of you there on Thursday, August 10th. Are there any other events or announcements that folks would like to make? Upcoming events? Yes.
The Built Green Conference is September 14th, but I want to announce that now because the sooner you buy your tickets, the cheaper they are. So.
Thank you. Any other things to share for the audience? Yes.
I was going to mention it as part of my presentation, but October 11th, PSRC will be is organizing a regional equitable transit-oriented development event in Beacon Hill, and so save the date. The save the date announcement is not yet going out, but will be very shortly. So.
Thank you.
11th, 9 to 3.
So we have the Built Green Conference in September and the Equitable Transit-Oriented Development in October. So both those should be on your radar. So please make sure to sign in on the sign-in sheets that are going around in case you haven't done so already. We just want to get a sense of how many people have attended so that we can continue to provide you great programming like this. So today I'm really excited to be putting together this panel and bringing these folks to you. So today we're focusing on planning for equitable and sustainable growth. We know that King County and all of our cities in the region are rapidly growing. Seattle leads the 50 most populous cities in the country and is the fastest growing city in the country, adding more people on average each year than the years after the gold rush. We also know that other cities in the county are also growing nearly as fast, with Renton and Kent having more than doubled and tripled in population respectively since 1990. We also have King County's demographer in the room, so if you have further questions about that, you can ask him. There's Chandler in the back. We also know that as a region, we're a very fast-growing region that's experiencing a lot of challenges around affordable housing, displacement, and other equity and development pressures associated with rapid growth and population change. And we have several people that we're featuring today that are working on tackling these issues. And as we grow, really, how do we plan for sustainability and climate change as our populations are growing, and think about how that growth is benefiting or not benefiting certain areas of our residents? So this conversation today, we have three speakers. Elizabeth Kneebone from the Brookings Institute is presenting remotely up on the screen. Elizabeth Kneebone is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute and a co-founder of Confronting Suburban Poverty in America. Her work primarily focuses on urban and suburban poverty, metropolitan demographics, and tax policies that support low-income workers and communities. Prior to joining Brookings, Kneebone worked as a research project manager for IFF, formerly the Illinois Facilities Fund, where her work assessed the geographic distribution of need for services and programs targeted to low-income people and places. She holds a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and a bachelor's degree in history from Indiana University. And we invited her here today because she's the co-author of the book Confronting Suburban American Poverty, and one of their focus areas of their research was actually South King County. so I'm going to pass this. So she is promoting remotely, and unfortunately, the speaker system is only coming from the phone. So if everyone can be as quiet as possible so you can all hear her.
I will take that as my cue. Can you hear okay from there? Am I coming through okay? All right, great. Well, thanks so much, again, for the opportunity to be a part of the conversation this afternoon. I'm going to be remotely presenting on work that we've been doing here at the Brookings Institution for more than a decade now, looking at the changing geography of poverty and specifically the rapid rise of poverty in the suburbs of our major metro areas. So just to take a look at what that looks like nationally. Hello?
Keep going.
Okay, great. So if we look at this nationally, we know that poverty has grown in all types of communities in the 2000s. Cities, suburbs, small metropolitan areas, rural communities. But the 2000s were particularly striking because not only the rapid rise of poverty, but this shift. We passed the tipping point for the first time, where now not only were suburbs home to the fastest pace of growth in the poor population in the country, they also, for the first time, became home to the largest number of poor people, surpassing cities in the middle of the 2000s. By 2015, there were more than 3 million more poor in the suburbs of our major metro areas compared to the major cities that anchor those places. And this wasn't just a trend driven by a few regions. It was really something shared across the country. Almost every major metro area saw poverty grow in their suburbs. And as was mentioned, the Seattle region was very much a part of this trend. In fact, for many decades, there have been more poor residents outside the core cities of this region. But in the 2000s, we very much saw the same sort of rapid expansion and that growing gap between the suburban poor population and the numbers in the city. We really saw the peak in that post-recession period. But even by 2015, the poor population was 63% larger in the suburbs than it had been in 2000. That means that there are about 100,000 more poor people in the suburbs in 2015 compared to in 2000. So it's a very rapid pace of growth. So while that growth has been felt throughout the region, it hasn't been felt equally or evenly. The distribution has varied across places. So if we look at census tract level poverty rates in the region in 2000 and compare that with the most recent data we have in the 2011-15 era, you can see this filling in. A number of places passing over that 10% poverty threshold, the 20% poverty threshold, where we start to see the negative effects of concentrated poverty start to emerge. And you see that a lot of those clusters are really filling in that South King County area, and even more to the south and to the north, but there's a particular concentration, which we can see showing up in the poverty rates of these places over time. We have many of these South King County municipalities. They started very similar poverty rates to the city of Seattle, if not lower. By the end of this period, they were several percentage points higher than when it began, growing by 4 percentage points in places like Renton, but up to double-digit growth in the poverty rate in Tukwila. And now you see almost all of these places have poverty rates above what we see in the city of Seattle. So really is this regionalizing growth at the same time it's concentrating and becoming, we're seeing more pockets of poverty growth throughout the region. And there are a lot of reasons why we've seen this rapid rise both in the Seattle region and nationally that we can start to unpack a bit to understand what's driving some of these trends. One is about population changes, growth and demographic shifts. This region has grown faster on average than others across the country, as was mentioned in the opening. And like other regions in the country, the fastest pace of growth actually occurred in the suburbs. So 20% growth in this 2000 to 2015 period. And as the suburbs have grown and added more people, they become more diverse, both demographically and economically. Some of this is about shifting immigration patterns. We've seen increasingly as immigrants and foreign-born come into new regions, they're bypassing cities altogether and moving to the suburbs. That's a piece of the story, and it's certainly a piece of the population growth we've seen, particularly in the Seattle region. But it's a bigger piece of the overall population growth than it is necessarily the poor population. Between this period of 2000 to 2011-15, The foreign-born poor contributed about 30%, just under 30% of the growth that we saw, that rapid increase in the poor population in the suburbs, in the Seattle region. So that's going to vary from community to community, but on the whole, like we've seen across the country, this is largely a native-born phenomenon driving this trend. Why are we seeing some of these shifts in population and in the poor population in particular? Some of this is about housing. Where is affordable housing located within the region? That can be unpacked in a number of ways. On one hand, where are the subsidies? We've seen a shift towards portable vouchers as a way of giving housing assistance, and that's the whole point, that they're portable. And we've seen efforts to increase portability so people really do have choice in where they use those vouchers. And as a result, in the Seattle region and in regions across the country, we've seen a growing number of housing vouchers, housing voucher holders using those vouchers in suburban communities. But it's not just about subsidies either, it's about larger market forces. And the Seattle region is on the forefront of this trend, rising housing prices in the city as redevelopment takes place, as there's a desirability to move downtown. It's pushing housing prices up at a faster pace than elsewhere in the region. People may be looking farther out to where naturally occurring sort of market affordable housing is located, which is often in South King County and even farther south communities, which is helping to shift some of these trends over time. But it's not just housing too, it's also the labor market and the regional economy more broadly. One way to look at this is where jobs are locating over time. Most major metro areas have seen jobs shift out and continue to suburbanize. When we look at a picture of what's happening in the Seattle region, we've seen that when we look at the number of nearby jobs, what are the jobs within a commuting distance of a neighborhood? In many parts of the region, that's actually improved over time. But a lot of these lower income communities, a lot on the south side and South King County, have actually seen the number of jobs nearby decline over time as they've moved farther away or created density in other clusters in other parts of the region, which may mean those economic opportunities are moving farther apart. Also, when you look at what types of jobs are located where, we see these higher paying jobs clustered in other parts of the region, and lower paying jobs more diffuse, more scattered, and more present in the south suburbs as well. So the types of jobs available and where they located absolutely mattered. Obviously, the economic cycle played a role in driving some of these trends as well. But I think these numbers really underscore that this wasn't just about the recession. It's not just a story that will bounce back as we move further into recovery. It's also about these sort of structural and geographic trends we see in this region and others as well. So what are the particular challenges? A number of different factors together have seen more poor people move to the suburbs, have seen more long-term residents become poor over time. Why does that matter for policy, for planning? What are some of the implications of that? So in our research, we've looked at a number of different things that maybe arise as a unique challenge in the suburban poor context. One, a lot of these communities weren't built with any sorts of infrastructure or support services in mind to help address the needs of a low-income population. Transit tends to be less present. I'll present some numbers. Again, this is a bit of a dated study at this point, but I think helps illustrate this point, that there are often gaps between not only where the transit is located, but how often are those stops served, what sort of frequency of service, and where does it actually take people to other parts of the region. One way to look at this in terms of what share of jobs would be reachable in a commute. We here offer a pretty generous 90 minutes, and you see that for suburban residents in low-income neighborhoods in the suburbs of the region, they can reach a far smaller share of the region's jobs compared to similar counterparts in urban neighborhoods. And then when you look at what types of jobs are most likely to be reachable by transit, again, low-skilled jobs are some of the less reachable, partly because they tend to often be more suburbanized. They're less clustered and centered downtown, where higher-skilled jobs tend to be more accessible. But it's not just transit either. It's also in terms of safety net. In this region, as we've seen across the country, the suburban safety net tends to be patchier, thinner. For instance, there are fewer nonprofit providers in the suburbs than in the city. And when we look at the resources of those providers, they often tend to also be smaller. They can be patchier in the types of services that they provide, and often because of lags in where philanthropic funding is going or where government funds may be available, their resources are often lower per poor person than what might be found in a city like Seattle that has had decades to build up this sort of infrastructure and support systems. So there are other challenges as well that when we think about not just the infrastructure and safety net supports, but how do we really mount the type of response needed to address the high and growing levels of need in these communities. Not just philanthropic and nonprofit capacity can be lacking in these places, but just staff and local government capacity to address human service needs, to address the needs of a growing low-income population. Many of these communities may themselves not be large enough in terms of capacity to deal with the growing needs. Part of the challenge is we're not just talking about one place when we talk about the suburbs. We're talking about a collection of municipalities, of unincorporated counties, where you can be looking at a fragmented map of many places dealing with really what are regional challenges, but in ways that which they're not really operating at scale that they can adequately marshal a response. And part of this is not helped, as I mentioned before, by an inflexible and often unreliable funding landscape. In many ways, that was built for a very different geography of poverty. A lot of the government programs that we have available for place-based anti-poverty efforts were built with urban and distressed areas in mind, in cities or in rural communities. Those places obviously are still struggling with these challenges, but those resources don't often extend or map easily onto the suburban context. So what we've seen is adding this all up with the challenges, but also the trends coming together. What do we take away from this in the work that we've been doing? One, obviously, labor markets and economic opportunity are often regional, but connecting to those opportunities, that kind of mechanism often operates at the local level. And if the goal really is to figure out how to connect more low-income and minority residents to opportunities to have economic stability and success, we really have to think about this now, not just in terms of neighborhoods or even cities, but regionally, really understand that the role of suburbanization of poverty is to craft those sorts of plans and strategies if we want to reach people where they are today. And to do that, given the challenges that I've laid out, it's become very clear to us that a regional approach that leverages collaboration is increasingly in order. It's really what demands to meet the scale of the need today. And as I was doing this research over the years in King County, in the Seattle region, and in other metros across the country, we were noticing that the innovative approaches, the sort of best practices and promising models that were emerging, we're all finding sort of three common tenets that seem to undergird their innovation or their success. One, that they were trying to get to a better scale, either in terms of geography or the scope of issues that they were addressing. To do that, they were often collaborating and leveraging integration to try and cut across geographic boundaries or policy silos. And in this very resource-constrained environment, they were figuring out ways to take limited resources and use them to fund strategically, often employing data to figure out the best way to deploy limited resources so that you can help more people in more places. So just briefly, I want to offer a few examples from elsewhere in the country of ways that people are using these sort of three tenets to deal with this more regional scope of not only poverty, but also thinking about how to really connect people to better economic opportunities. So one example comes from the Denver region, where they really saw a lot of forward-thinking partners, public, private, quasi-public agencies came together around their fast track build-out, realizing they were making this incredible investment in their public transit infrastructure, and that was an opportunity, if seized upon, to help increase equity and inclusion in that sort of build-out. And the way that they did that was by creating this flexible pool of funds that would allow them to look at, where are these transit lines going, where are there affordable areas now that we could buy into, knowing that soon they'll be developing rapidly with this access to transit. So how do we make sure we take advantage of those opportunities to buy low and then develop to make sure that there are affordable housing opportunities, either preservation or creation of affordable units around these sites, things like community spaces and nonprofit spaces so that you can kind of agglomerate some of those opportunities around these transit lines so that you're really creating a more inclusive model of development around transit. They were able to do this. The first $15 million fund they spent down and created a revolving loan fund that now, as they've expanded it and grown the pool of funds, operates regionally and helps them, again, with these development projects, not just of affordable housing, but also community facilities and business spaces. Another example comes out of the Chicago region, where really this is a region where there's a longer history of collaboration in different forms, but the housing crisis really brought a lot of communities to the table, realizing they were struggling with blight, with foreclosures, with vacancies. You know, the south suburbs in particular of Cook County, south of the city of Chicago, were hit hardest by the foreclosure crisis. And when the neighborhood stabilization funds came online from the federal government, they realized they weren't set up to succeed if they were just going to be competing against each other, because they didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the resources to successfully apply, let alone to implement on those funds and actually achieve the goals that they were really sharing. So they worked with regional intermediaries to come together. Originally it was 19 small Southside suburban municipalities that expanded to 25 over the years to craft that initial application. They were successful in attracting funds, and since then have been able to bring in millions of federal, state, local, and private dollars to that collaborative area, meaning basically a 50-to-1 return on the philanthropic investment that helped seed that initial collaboration. With that, they've been able to create all kinds of tools like a land bank, a TOD fund. They've invested and shared data tools that as they have this common pool of money, they can have a transparent process for actually allocating those funds, so every community can see how that they are working together to prioritize those dollars. I realize that I think I'm right about out of time, so I'm happy to come through another couple of examples in the questions and Q&A, return to that discussion. But thanks again for including me, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
So thank you, Elizabeth, for starting us off. We're going to have our two other panelists go as well, and then we're going to open up for questions after that. So the next person is Michael Hubner. Michael is a principal planner with the Growth Management Division of the Puget Sound Regional Council. His work addresses regional growth management and land use policy, housing and housing affordability, equitable transit-oriented development, and implementation through local plans. Michael brings nearly 20 years of experience in multi-jurisdictional policy development in his work at PSRC, these are long sentences, which in the coming years will focus on updating Vision 2040 and a plan for sustainable growth, transportation, environmental health, and economic vitality in the Seattle metropolitan area. Michael will be sharing a bit more about PSRC's Growing Transit Communities strategy, which was one of the joint commitments of the King County Cities Climate Collaborative, K4C, and also talk about what are they doing for the future.
Great, thank you very much. I think you touched on one of my professional goals for this year is to write shorter sentences. I'm probably not alone. Oh boy, I'm not quite sure how this goes. Oh, there we go. Fix that picture. Oh. Okay, so I'm not sure if I can see it there. I need to be close to there. So I'm going to talk about some things that are a little historical at this point in terms of how, as a region, we got to a point in having regional policy discussions and actions around equitable development, and then talk about some things that are happening now, and we can look forward to it in the future as we continue that work. And here's my clicker. So, oh boy. Did I mess you up? Well, how do I advance the slide? First and foremost, Puget Sound Regional Council. We are the 4-county regional metropolitan planning organization for the Seattle region. So that's King County, Snohomish County, Pierce County, and Kitsap County, for those of you who are not familiar with us. We do growth management planning. We do transportation planning. Importantly, we are a conduit for federal transportation dollars that are administered regionally through a very collaborative and inclusive process involving all the local governments in those 4 counties. We do economic development. We're also the Economic Development District, a federal designation as well for the 4-county region. There we go. So 4 counties, 82 cities and towns, urban and rural areas, state agencies and tribal governments are also engaged. So a lot of opportunity for collaboration and for considering considering these questions at a regional scale. As was mentioned in the introduction, we are growing. There are many hyperbolic ways to talk about how fast, how big we are growing. I just have a couple here, and this is a little bit dated. This is from a couple of years ago. The region grew by 63,000 people and 76,000 jobs in the 2014 to 2015 period. That's 7 people per hour, nearly 9 jobs per hour. If you stand at the gates of the region, you can see them come on in. Over the 2000 through roughly 2015, the region basically grew by an additional Tacoma. So Tacoma's a fairly sizable city within our region, and we're seeing that level of growth, and it has only continued, if not increased, in the years since then. Where is that growth going? It's a very quick snapshot here. This goes back to 1990, but it gives a sense of, this shows the residential permits in the region. And I know that this, the context for this discussion is to consider regional sustainability, and a lot of that relating to our land use pattern and our means of getting around the region through transportation. And you can see that the region has been filling in. We've actually been growing in our central cities. Some of our remaining lands within the urban area, the darker blue areas, areas that have seen a lot of new residential units produced over time. And we expect a lot more growth in the future. These are the regional forecasts going out to the year 2040, the time period for our current regional plan. And we anticipate between roughly now and the year 2040, a million additional people and nearly a million additional jobs. So that's a huge planning challenge, and one which we wrestle with as a region collaboratively at PSRC. The region is also changing in terms of its level of diversity and the demographics. Elizabeth Kneebone touched on the suburbanization of poverty. I have a couple of slides here that illustrate this suburbanization of that sort of demographic change. This is the percent minority at a census tract level in the year 1990. Fast forward to 2013. And you can see that the level of diversity, the darkest blue areas here are majority minority census tracts. So going backward, forward, quite a larger swath of the region is now majority minority, and that has only been growing over time as well. Another way to look at that is to look at the children who are in minority households. There are two ways of looking at that here. One is the overall numbers, but then I particularly like the image at the right, which shows the more concentrated, the denser areas that have higher numbers of minority children. This is also and a little bit more of a finer grain indicator of households where some of the equity questions and needs are most pronounced. And you can see that those are concentrated in the southern part of Seattle into South King County and down into Pierce County, and then along the Highway 99 corridor going up into Snohomish County. So there are various ways of looking at the changing demographic picture in the region. Among the things that we're monitoring and paying very close attention to, of course, is housing affordability. Just a couple of quick statistics here for context. As Elizabeth Kneebone also suggested, increasing rents are feeding into that displacement or changing residential choice of central city versus suburb. And here you see our 4 counties as well as the city of Seattle and the rent trend over time. It's actually even more pronounced than in the slide that Elizabeth had, and it shows that Seattle, the rent has increased by at least 50% since 2010. That leads the region. King County also out front with respect to increasing rents. Where the pain of that increasing rent is felt most heavily is not surprisingly in lower income households. And this is one way of looking at drilling down into those statistics a little bit. And I would call your attention to the dark blue part of the bars at the bottom, which show that the numbers of households that are severely cost burdened in the region is increasing, and particularly households that are earning less than 50% of area median income, or less than 50% of area median income, and fully 100,000 of those households are paying more than half of their income for housing, and that's primarily rent. And that's an indicator of risk of homelessness and inability to meet other basic needs for those households. So it's a real crisis in terms of the rent and the pressures on households. So shifting gears here, just very quickly, we have our regional plan for sustainability. It's Vision 2040. There's a regional growth strategy predicated on the idea that as a region, we want to focus growth in the urban areas, particularly in cities, particularly in centers, which are denser, mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented small areas. They're linked together with high-capacity transit. So that's what you see depicted on this map. We have goals and policies and actions that are aimed at achieving that land use pattern, that integrated transportation system. But what that does is it does present some challenges for addressing not only the housing issues, but also how that future planned pattern of development and accessibility, how that impacts households of all kinds and incomes. And it's something that we're increasingly called to look at. So this is how we thought of sustainability in developing Vision 2040. I pulled up this graphic. I hadn't intended to include it here, and I realized there's an equity is not in this chart. And we went back and looked at the document, the Vision 2040 document. The word equity doesn't occur in the document. So this is huge for us going forward to updating Vision 2040, which is a project that we're taking on in the next several years. We're anticipating adopting an updated plan by the year 2020. And it really is including equity in the picture here is an essential part of the constellation of things that are important for regional sustainability, for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is that providing more equitable choices, both in terms of mobility and housing for all households, helps to achieve those environmental outcomes that we also want to see achieved for climate change and many other benefits. After Vision 2040 was adopted, there was interest in expanding what the Regional Council was looking at in terms of not only housing, but also having the Sound Transit 2 ballot measure just recently passed to take a look at how we could grow more equitably and sustainably. The Regional Council obtained a $5 million grant for a 3-year project called Growing Transit Communities. There were many moving pieces in this project. I'm just going to give it a light brush here, and if you're curious, I have an executive summary and be happy to answer questions offline. But basically, this was a collaborative planning project that got outside the walls of PSRC, pulled together a broad consortium of governmental, non-governmental, community-based, environmental, transit agencies to talk about how we could leverage our transit investments to provide equitable opportunities for focusing growth around transit station areas and address growth, housing affordability, and access to opportunity. We worked very closely with a newly formed group called the Regional Equity Network that involved community-based organizations from throughout the region, met together for a number of times and held a number of public events around this consortium. And we had, under the $5 million grant, $500,000 to provide for local capacity building projects. So that was a big piece of the equity engagement that we did through the Growing Transit Communities project. We developed a number of housing affordability tools that I'll touch on in a slide coming down a couple of slides further here. And these were our study areas you can see represented in this map. We looked at existing conditions. We started there. That's a really important part of planning for equity, is to understand the realities on the ground right now as a basis for going forward. I won't touch on these specifically, but just to give a sense of the comprehensiveness of the analysis we did going into this. We did an opportunity mapping exercise. I believe that Uba from the City of Seattle is going to talk about some opportunity analysis that the city did as well. This is a national model for looking at the proximity and access for households to a whole range of societal benefits, access to jobs, to education, a healthy environment, many others. And we did a proximity analysis at a census tract level. And I think of this as a map of fairness. This is a map that shows how fairly those benefits are distributed geographically within the region, and how that aligns with households by income and race and so forth. We came up with a set of strategies and actions, not only for PSRC, in fact, now I wouldn't say even mainly for PSRC, but for cities, transit agencies, non-governmental organizations, the menu of actions that will be necessary to meet our three-part goals: attract growth, affordable housing, access to opportunity. I just want to touch on a couple of these here, because there is a lot that has happened since this grant. In terms of the number one under what we call foundation strategies, continuing the regional program, we have our regional growing transit communities compact. It's kind of a promise. It's not a contract in the sense of a binding document, but we've invited local governments and other governmental and non-governmental groups to sign on and pledge to advance these sets of strategies as a unified and coordinated approach for equitable transit oriented development regionally. We currently have nearly 50 signatories, and they meet regularly as a regional transit oriented development advisory committee. Under attracting growth, station area plans and local comprehensive plans, the county and most of the cities in King County recently updated their comprehensive plans, and we've seen equity and transit-oriented development as a bigger, higher profile issue addressed in those plans. Under housing choices, there's a lot that has happened since we did the Growing Transit Communities project. Just briefly note that with respect to a TOD property acquisition fund, we have a fund similar to the one in Denver that Elizabeth Kneebone described. It's called the READY Fund, Regional Equitable Development Initiative Fund. There's a mouthful. Enterprise Community Partners is administering that fund. I had coffee with James Madden at Enterprise just this morning and got the rundown on some projects that are going through the pipeline to possibly use that fund to acquire sites and station areas for mixed income development. As well, Sound Transit under the ST3 authorization is now much more heavily engaged in equitable development around their assets and their investments, both in terms of how they're disposing of surplus lands and making it available for equitable development, as well as in the future providing more seed capital for this TOD fund or one like it. So there's a lot going on through Sound Transit. Both of those things came very substantially out of the work that we did with Growing Transit Communities. And finally, on the access to opportunity, one of the things that we'll likely be doing as part of the vision update is updating our opportunity mapping at a regional scale, and look forward to working with folks to do that work. I'm going to close by just highlighting a couple of things that we're doing at PSRC. So back to within our house, we have three plans, main regional plans. They're all going through at some stage of being updated, and each of these, the equity component is really important and new. We have a regional economic strategy that comes out of our Economic Development District Board. It's in the final phases of being updated right now. This plan integrates social equity. They employed early engagement with a number of new partners. There is an express goal to open economic opportunities to everyone, and there are strategies and actions that speak to social equity. So that's fairly, arguably much higher profile for our regional economic plan. Transportation 2040 is sort of mid-course in being updated with an adoption in early next year. They're newly incorporated into this work is a regional equity analysis, more focused engagement opportunities for a number of partners. They've been working with Transportation Choices Coalition and others to do that. And targeted outreach to impacted communities with an emphasis on mobility options and accessibility. And finally, we will be, as I noted, we will be updating Vision 2040 starting next year. We really want to not reinvent the wheel on any of these, both the engagement and the analytic pieces, and want to look back on the work that we've done in-house as well as what other partners in the region have done to get it right with respect to how equity intersects with the regional plan, how we can raise the bar in terms of outreach and engagement, and really to substantially address the role, benefits, and impacts of growth, that 1 million people and 1 million jobs. Well, we're going out to 2050, and we're really talking about even more growth than that, and facing some really interesting and hard choices about where that growth goes, how we serve it, and who's impacted, and what the roles of various players are, not only the regional council, but cities, transit agencies, and others. So I'm going to leave it there. That's what we're doing. So a high-level flyover and turn it over to, I know City of Seattle's going to get down a little bit more local.
So our last speaker today is Uba Gardiri, and she is the Equitable Development Strategies Manager at the City of Seattle's Office of Planning and Community Development. She prioritizes working towards equity, authentically listening to community, and has extensive experience in community development and building an inclusive vision with many of Seattle's communities of color. Uba was a program director with Puget Sound Sage prior to her work with the city, developing equitable land use policies such as affordable housing and equitable transit-oriented development, utilizing a race and social justice lens. Uba speaks English, Somali, and Swahili, and serves on the boards of the African Diaspora of Washington, Culturally Appropriate and Responsive Education Center, CARE Center, and is also on the board of Communities of Opportunity and the Social Justice Fund Northwest. She has a bachelor's in Management Information Systems from WSU and a master's in Public Administration from Seattle University. And we invited her here today to talk a bit about the city's new Equitable Development Initiative, a set of strategies to address equity in underserved communities and displacement as their city faces all of this growth.
Thank you, Jamie. I wanted to share a little bit of my story as people are talking about access to opportunity and displacement. I'm a single parent of 3 kids and lived in South King County majority of my life, went to high school there. And about 6 years ago, when my oldest son was starting kindergarten, looking for opportunities for them, decided to move to Bellevue. So I live in Bellevue in Crossroads area. But what I realized when I did that, I also, as a single parent, my mom helps me a lot, but she lives in Tukwila. And every weekend, I am in South King County because that's where my community is. So my transportation costs went high. Like 5 days a week right now, I take the bus to the city of Seattle. But still, whatever I save those 5 days a week, I'm contributing to climate impacts and drive a gas guzzler for an equitable development person to South King County. So I just wanted to share that. But today I'm going to talk about the Equitable Development Initiative and start with what our vision for the Equitable Development Initiative is, which pretty much is having Seattle be a diverse city where all people thrive regardless of race and means. And probably start with defining equitable development. But before I do that, can anybody tell me how they define equitable development? Anybody here? Okay. So we define equitable development as an approach of creating healthy, vibrant communities and includes investments, programs, and policies that meet the needs of marginalized populations and reduces disparities. And center equity, because in order to achieve equitable outcomes, we have to also recognize the widespread disinvestments that has happened and also policies that have benefited some folks more than others. Oops, sorry. So today I will spend a lot of my time talking about the Equitable Development Implementation Plan, but before that, I just want to go quickly give you a little bit about how that came about. So City of Seattle was updating its 2035 comprehensive plan about 3 years ago. And even though equity is one of the core values, they recognized that the elements of the comp plan did not have policies and goals for racial equity. So they started with that piece. And then had equity analysis also as a companion to the environmental impact statement to inform the growth strategies. So as they looked at all the 4 alternatives, they realized that no matter which alternative they ended up with, marginalized communities will be displaced. So what kind of policies and strategies and investments can we put together to mitigate those displacement? And the Equitable Development Implementation Plan then was born out of that, and it's a framework with the dual purposes of mitigating displacement and increasing access to opportunity, centering strong communities and people, and then also creating access to opportunities in other high opportunity neighborhoods. It has a systemic change approach, and then a targeted strategies in places that have high risk displacement, and obviously a stewardship plan. So this is the equity analysis, and as you can see, the displacement risk map shows the story of areas that have had marginalized communities and low-income communities have high-risk displacement. And if you look at the access to opportunity, anywhere from south of the Ship Canal, also they have low access to opportunity. Some of the indicators that they used was like looking at communities of color, low speaking ability, education attainment, and things like that. And I can talk to you about how that was done. But a lot of times people ask me what kind of criteria that was used, so I just wanted to mention some of them. And this is an example of layers in the equity analysis. Again, if you remember the first map I showed around displacement risk, and then, for example, look at the proximity to regional job centers. The communities that have high-risk displacement also don't have proximity to jobs and access to jobs. And then the household income, again, tells the story of the opportunity and access to opportunity, where, again, the groups that had low access to opportunity are mostly low-income communities of color in south of the Ship Canal. So I included this because not all the areas are positioned equally, right? So we have to think about different strategies and different levels of investment in order to reach these communities. So if you look at Rainier Beach and Othello, for example, they have their neighborhoods that have high displacement risk and low access to opportunities. And then on the other side, if you look at areas like Central Area, Chinatown, International District, even though they have high access to opportunity, they are prone to displacement because they, again, they're mostly communities of color who, even though that actually increases, the rents are higher in those neighborhoods and things like that. So just wanted to make sure that I put this, because I'm gonna later on talk about some targeted strategies, and a lot of times folks ask, why did you choose these neighborhoods? So I just wanted to put this in context. So the Equitable Development Framework builds on the Puget Sound region and a framework, 6 equity drivers. Advancing economic mobility and opportunity, preventing displacement of vulnerable residents, just not residential displacement, but also cultural displacement and economic displacement, building on cultural assets. So that first 3 equity drivers is what I look at it as the place-based equity drivers that create strong people and resilient communities. And then the other 3 is like developing healthy and safe neighborhoods all over the city, distributing the benefits of burdens and growth equitably and investments, and finally increasing opportunity for low-income households of color to live in all neighborhoods. This is an example of one of the equity drivers, the advancing economic mobility, and the devil is in the details. The rest are structured similarly, and the equity outcomes that we're looking at for this one is all like closing racial disparities. We name race in this and make sure that we are actually focusing on those neighborhoods and those areas. So the Equitable Development Implementation Plan has a systemic change approach to eliminate inequities. The first one is establishing equity criteria to determine community development and planning priorities, looking at marginalized population, what is the displacement risk, and how do these communities have or don't have access to opportunity. And then within the city of Seattle, forming equity-driven interdepartmental structures to set shared priorities, goal, and budget decisions to actually build our investments and how we make investments, especially as it's concerned with capital departments. And then the third one is integrate equity into the functional and investment plans. And finally, having a monitoring program, because we have to hold each other accountable and figure out if we're meeting those equitable outcomes that we have put in place. So a little bit about the Equitable Development Monitoring Program. It's in Resolution 31577 and pretty much says that the City of Seattle will report annually on equity measures and work with the community. So because we believe that the communities who are impacted by growth are in the best position in collecting data and reporting on it, and then also with the Planning Commission so that we're all holding each other accountable. Again, this kind of still talks about the monitoring program, and it pretty much has two types of indicators. One, short-term early warning signs of displacement, and the second one, just the equitable development outcomes. The first one is designed to be actually reported in every year, and the long term is as data becomes available. And then the Office of Planning and Community Development actually coordinates this monitoring program that just started right now. So the mayor also at the beginning of the year formed a high-level decision-making body to provide executive guidance on the long-term strategic planning and policy development, consistent with the vision that I first started with, and coordinating infrastructure to support growth and close these racial disparities. The intention of this body is to work closely together to achieve these equity goals and again, hold each other accountable. I also wanted to mention that the city has citywide strategies. How many of you have heard the famous housing affordability and livability agenda? Yeah, so which just has policies and recommendations to preserve communities impacted by displacement. The next 10 years, the city of Seattle will bring in 50,000 households. So this housing affordability and livability agenda has over 65 recommendations that is going to make sure out of those 50,000 households, 20,000 of those low income to 80% area medium income and below. And then also, as I talked about, the dual purpose of the Equitable Development Initiative is increasing access to opportunity, so also looking at commercial affordability and incentivizing small spaces. So I talked about the neighborhoods that had high risk of displacement. So the Equitable Development Initiative has targeted place-based strategies focusing on these neighborhoods. These neighborhoods have shared characteristics. One, they have high level of chronic and most recent displacement risk. They've had disinvestment due to history of redlining and racially restrictive covenants. They all have had recent major transportation investments. So sometimes we bring in transportation investments to increase access to opportunity, but they also impact these neighborhoods, because what happens, the land prices go up and these communities end up being displaced. And then they all had recently updated neighborhood plans, but not any implementation of those plans. So the Equitable Development Initiative is figuring out how do we move a step forward out of planning and just figure out how we are implementing some of these plans before they become too late. Much of this work is underway right now, and there is community-driven projects that share these equity drivers as the communities have envisioned it. You know, they advance economic mobility and opportunity, prevent residential, commercial and cultural displacement, and build on local cultural assets. When I talk about the local cultural assets, a lot of time, what I joke about is when I moved to Bellevue, I had the house, I had the good schools, but I had to go back to South King County to find that good food. And, you know, and the mosques and places that I loved to hang out in. So and sometimes you can move somebody to a place that has high access to opportunity, but are we putting the cultural assets in place so that this community can also thrive in place and not move back and forth to look for those cultural assets? So we are, this is some of the projects in Rainier Beach. They have a food innovation district. Othello has Southeast Economic Opportunity Center. Central area has this William Gross Center for Culture Innovation, which is a technology hub, and then Little Saigon Landmark Project. So if you, these are some of the projects that we're looking at, community-driven projects. So we are also lucky enough that we have some money. The Equitable Development Initiative, before it started, also we have about $16 million. We still don't have it. We have a loan because it's going to come out of a sale of city property in downtown Seattle. That's $16 million, and then also $430,000 CDBG money to actually help some of these projects and any other projects in high-risk displacement neighborhoods that that meet the equitable development criteria. So we're setting up the criteria right now, figuring out, you know, a lot of times when we're making investments to projects, people just want to jump to real estate and how are we going to do that? But realizing, taking a step back as we are working with these communities and realizing that we really need to build the capacity for these communities so that they are actually understand planning and community development and are actually resourced to be at the tables when they're negotiating with real estate. And also the other things that people need before they get site control, you know, pre-development and environmental and all that. So just realize as I've been doing research that there's not a lot of groups, even nationally, a government that started an equitable development initiative with a fund. So trying to figure out how do we balance efficiency with equity. Because sometimes if we are investing in equity, we might not see those outcomes up front that we are looking at, but we are addressing some of the inequities and increasing the capacity of these groups to be able to be in a place where if they want to be developers or if they want to just engage in community development and real estate and all that. So capacity building is as important as, you know, site control and things like that. So just how do we figure out an equity frame to make sure that we are resourcing community for their expertise and things like this. So this is the stewardship plan that I talked about. The 6 equity drivers are not designed to be deployed on their own, right? So at the City of Seattle, we and the Office of Planning and Community Development, we look at long-range plans and do a lot of planning. We don't do economic development. Office of Economic Development does that. Office of Housing talks about displacement and that does that work. Transportation is another department. So when I talked about the equity functional plans that we are putting together, how are we coordinating all that so that we're creating a transformational change and not a transactional change? It's still a work in progress which is starting right now, but we're just trying to envision and figure out what that looks like. And it cannot be done, like leadership cannot do it by themselves. as city government employees, we have to figure out and understand equity. So how are we investing in that piece for our staff capacity? Where is that external accountability? You know, the monitoring program that I talked about, and internal accountability within among ourselves in the different departments. How are we not competing for resources, but collaborating to leverage our resources to get to those equitable outcomes that I've talked about? So I am going to leave it at that and see if there's any questions.
So as you've seen through all three presentations, this is a dense topic with a lot of intersections. There's a lot of tensions between, you know, our goals around transit and mobility, affordable housing, creating economic opportunities for our residents, and also some questions that came up for me too is resourcing this work as well, right? So how do we have a regional perspective? How do we pay for things like this, especially for some of our smaller jurisdictions that might not have the resources to come up with a comprehensive plan that tackles all of those things? And then also, you know, this is, as Elizabeth talked about earlier as well, we have, you know, this is an issue that's happening across the country. It's not just in our region, but across the country. And I don't think there is a one answer. So I'm curious to hear from you all any questions that you have for our three panelists. I know that we have about 20 more minutes, so I want to make sure I open it up to the audience first. And if no one has questions, I'll ask a question. But is there anyone who has a question for our panelists? Yeah.
Thanks for coming today. My name's David Barnes, City of Kirkland. Specifically, Uba, on your presentation where you talked about staff capacity. So as I was listening to you, I was thinking to myself, okay, I live in Seattle, I've worked in government in Kirkland, and recently just completed Leadership Tomorrow training. And so I'm very familiar with the subject matter, but I'm wondering what is really going to be done as far as the cultural competency of the people working at the City of Seattle, people who will be implementing this initiative, and people who will be managing it and monitoring it and nurturing it in the future. So I didn't really hear too much about that, and I'm curious how the different departments and the many different working pieces in such a large city are gonna play nice together and work on this all together. And I'm interested in this from, that's where I live, but I'm also interested in, for my own city where I work, your thoughts on this.
Before you answer, just so you know, people on the phone can only hear through here.
Okay, so if you want to repeat the question, and then here's for the TV recording.
So the question was, how are we gonna resource staff capacity at the City of Seattle and increase cultural competency? So this has to do with race and social equity, and this is the same question that actually I'm grappling with right now. I've been there for about 7 months. City of Seattle has Office of Civil Rights, and then each department has something called a change team that works on the race and social justice initiative for each department. So that's one place where some of the analysis and increasing analysis of the staff happens. The second piece for the Equitable Development Initiative is having trainings and having resources, actually funding for trainings on social justice, on equitable growth. I am lucky enough to also, for this initiative, have some consulting money that can be used for some trainings. And then also the projects and the sponsors that we're working with are not real estate experts. So how are we doing trainings with the community to get them into a place not to be real estate per se, but to just have enough to be able to negotiate for their needs. But still, we need more funding to be able to resource things like that, because people don't see value in things like that. But like I said, I'm lucky enough to have some resources every year, about 200,000, to be able to play with and do things like that.
I just have a question. Is there a possibility of getting copies of the presentations that were shared today?
Yes, we can do that.
Yeah. I have a question about housing choices and increasing access into the higher opportunity areas. I'm just wondering if any thought has been put into providing housing that really considers different family models. Because I know that different cultures have different ways that they want to live with their family, and smaller and smaller units may not support that.
Yes, so the question was about whether providing a range of housing choices, equitable housing choices in urban areas is not only considers affordability, but also the type and size of unit to accommodate different types and sizes of households, especially around the different needs that may be associated with different cultures. So it is certainly, just at a somewhat high level, we certainly heard that interest and concern through the Growing Transit Communities process. It was part of the strategy is to encourage larger units, more variety of housing types, different variety of housing tenure, not just rental, but ownership, in-station areas. We didn't come out of the process with a very precise or a specific toolbox on that. I'd be curious. I know there's some housing experts in the room that probably know a lot more than I do about that. I know that the emphasis thus far has primarily been around affordability level in terms of the tools that we've advanced. But Upa, the city probably has some experience with that.
Yeah, so I was also part of the HALA group, and that question came out a lot, especially a lot of immigrant families who are being displaced to South King County is because they can't get, housing that's big enough. And then there's also the question around the multi-generation. So one of the things I think they looked at was the ADUs and DADUs. And then also the mandatory housing affordability that the city is working on right now, trying to encourage bigger, like 3-4 bedroom in some of the housing that the developers are putting in place that are affordable. And then the multifamily preservation, which actually didn't pass in Olympia, but just preserving those big types. Those are the things that I can remember from that.
My name is Melissa. I'm with King Conservation District, and I wanted to introduce the idea of urban agriculture as part of equitable and sustainable development. Because, we need to move urban agriculture beyond quaint and to a sustainable, equitable part of development. So how do we get that into the early development policy level and create space for people to grow food in the city and even in the suburbs? And how can we then encourage people that's going to make it their growth sustainable, equitable. So if you have any thoughts on that.
So one of the projects that I talked about earlier in Rainier Beach, the Food Innovation District, they actually, one of the things, Rainier Beach is seen as a food desert, and they have an urban farm there. One of the things that they want to do is actually bring that up to scale and then have a project that sell some of those. And I think what we need to do is change some of our zoning, maybe figure out green zones in neighborhoods like that. And then obviously investing in those urban, because a lot of people look at agriculture in rural areas, but that it's actually a need, especially in low-income communities that are food desert. But then again, we have to like change our land use and zoning and come up with different ways of incentivizing that.
Yeah, I guess what I would add to that is with experience with the opportunity mapping and looking at access to, especially in the arena of public health and access to healthy communities, not only food deserts, but access to open space, even economic opportunity with respect to job training, and that's where the Rainier Beach is a nice example of where these things dovetail. So I think where the urban agriculture option is particularly important is identifying where there are gaps within communities where there are not access to those things, because urban agriculture can certainly is well suited to that.
So we'll start here and then go back there. So go ahead.
So my question has to do with where we're choosing to increase density. So along transit corridors absolutely makes sense, but there are transit corridors, like a lot of the maps were focusing south of the canal, but of course you have more affluent, more homogeneous neighborhoods that could also use an increase in density, and perhaps that would alleviate some pressures on these communities that have been more marginalized, but I know that's also very politically difficult, and so I was wondering if one, increasing density in those areas might actually help alleviate, or if that's just a hypothesis, and then secondly, are there any sort of political tools that have been put out there that might work? Just sort of wanted to bring up those neighborhoods and increasing density there too. And can you repeat the question?
Sure, I think that the question is about the planning approach toward future growth, which focuses density around high-capacity transit stations, such as Link Light Rail is the one I think we've been most focused on. There's certainly others. And whether, with respect to communities where there's a displacement risk, whether focusing more of that density in other station areas that don't have displacement risk can be a tool to reduce the risk for the communities that are around those transit investments. At a regional level, how we address that through growing transit communities is certainly to acknowledge, as well as to do some analysis around displacement risk, similar to the kind of analysis that Uba referred to in the city of Seattle, while at the same time recognizing that not only is there a regional transit system and there's a role for density and providing opportunities to reside close to transit throughout the region, but that there's mitigation of displacement as part of that picture. From my perspective, I think providing housing opportunities near transit in all stations it can be a net positive for communities across the income spectrum. The key there is ensuring that a sizable percentage of that new housing is affordable, and that those key properties that have those transit supportive density characteristics already, and there is a lot of naturally occurring affordable multifamily housing in a lot of our station areas, that preservation efforts are focused on those properties, so those are not the ones that are torn down and replaced by the new housing, but rather other kinds of uses. It's a difficult challenge. I know Seattle has been wrestling with this and has taken this on through doing its EIS process as well, which I'm really interested to watch the city do some more local work on that.
Yeah, so I just want to add, this is my own opinion with not wearing the City of Seattle scarf, but I think density all over the city is a great thing if it's coupled with affordability, like Bill here said. The City of Seattle is zoned mostly for single-family homes, and the communities that I talked about are being displaced because they can't afford those, single-family homes. So can we create townhomes or, incentivize mother-in-law cottages and things like that so that people can, afford those kind of homes is one thing that I think will be valuable as we are running out of land So that's what I want to add to that. But as far as policies, I can't think of one right now.
Oops. Very quickly, irrespective of the displacement risk in any particular community, I think a big emphasis of growing transit communities was looking at the potential to grow around station areas and to look at the walkshed, the areas within a walk distance of station areas, and really take a hard look at what we're doing as a region to provide as many opportunities to grow and develop, and including develop equitably around station areas. There are a number of station areas for which that area to grow around them is fairly small, and any opportunities to expand that to provide more opportunities for a variety of development is also can be a good thing to do. So.
Yeah, I think this question is mostly for Elizabeth, but curious to see if either of you have perspective on examples of regional tax policies that support equitable development. As you know, in King County, at least in Washington State, when we talk about regional funding, what that usually means is let's tax the county and then concentrate the funds in Seattle or in other urban centers. And so we've recently seen that with Best Start for Kids. We're probably going to see that with Access for All, which is the arts tax, and then also that's human services levy. So the question is in order to redistribute funds, what other models exist, or what other additional tax policies or revenue strategies are there around the country or regionally that we can look to?
So I'll do my best. That was a complicated question, but I'll summarize it as interested in models nationally of tax or revenue allocation models to support equitable development, and in the suburbs in particular. For a question for Elizabeth.
Great. And you may, I'm sorry I couldn't hear the questioner himself, might have referred to the regional tax-based sharing model from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area that came about in the 70s. And still, I think it's the most robust model that we've seen. It hasn't been widely replicated, but I think it is something to look into. One thing that we're trying to do right now, one of our colleagues is looking at some of the tax strategies that have been used to encourage economic development, actually gathering on-the-ground examples to see if there are ways that those are being leveraged, and potentially be able to tease out where might be the most effective tools as we think about inclusion and maybe existing tax strategies, perhaps not on a regional scale yet, but within localities or within certain places that they're leveraging to try and do that, which then again may provide examples for a sort of regional roadmap. But I think that this is still an area that a lot of places are trying to navigate now, especially in more distressed suburbs and more smaller places that we've definitely come across in our research on the growth of concentrated poverty, where they have lower tax bases to begin with, maybe stagnant, or sort of the opposite of a lot of the suburbs in the Seattle area, where they may be losing population at the same time seeing great need growing. I think some of those places we might see more experimentation sooner, even because there's more of a sort of urgency to try and figure out how they meet some of these basic services and economic development strategies together to try and address some of these issues. And that, again, that's something through some of the collaboratives I mentioned in Chicago that I think they're slowly starting to move towards is to try and exactly figure out what levers they can pull and how they can shift tax dollars around differently.
So I think we have time for one last question.
I would just ask, actually, you were talking about leveraging resources, and I was just curious where your preferred ways or ways you would suggest building capacity within marginalized communities to kind of leverage your investment even further.
Can you repeat the question?
So what are ways to leverage resources, especially in marginalized communities? That's the question, right? When I talked about leveraging, one of the things I was also thinking about, one is also first interdepartmentally. If, for example, some of the projects we're looking at has housing piece. How are we working with Office of Housing to leverage that? And $16 million is not enough money to even, fund one of those projects. But also outside of the departments itself, how are we working with, for example, Forterra right now has a new initiative where they are going to be land banking in some of those neighborhoods, right? And the city of Seattle or government money sometimes cannot be used for certain things. So how are we talking to each other across government, across nonprofits? I mean, my bio talked about the communities of opportunity, right? How is the communities of opportunity leveraging some of the funds that the city has to do the City of Seattle projects, and what is the City of Seattle doing to kind of mitigate actually the displacement that we as a city contributing to the suburbanization of poverty. So working across private, public, and sectors to actually figure that out and get out of our silos. And I think that's one of the ways that we really need to really come together and think about that regional table, that also resources capacity, because what we do is even with the regional equity, and was it $5 million or $500,000 for capacity?
We $500,000 in capacity grants, and that was a lot in the grand scheme of things. Yeah.
So that's okay, we used that, right? And in the process, maybe formed a lot of small nonprofits, and as soon as they had money left, we left those groups. So how are we thinking the long game to be able to actually sustain those kind of things, and thinking outside of that time frame for that funding?
So we're out of time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you all for coming. Can we give a hand to all of our speakers? So again, our next roundtable is in August 10th in Kent City Hall in their council chambers. And if you haven't signed in, please be sure to sign in. And thank you so much for coming today.